to begin tonight by asking you, where were you on New Year's Eve, not this past year, but 25 years ago? It was Y2K. Do you remember where you were? You know, were you? Okay. Well, that sounds like a wonderful way to greet the new millennium. Historians were making lists of all kinds of things, maybe not that very night, but as the new millennium was unfolding. And the religion editor of the Vancouver Sun, Douglas Todd, made a list of his own. He listed out 25 of the most significant spiritual leaders in British Columbia in the 20th century. And at the top of that list, the very top, was none other than the Reverend Bernice Gerard, of whom I will speak tonight and of whom I have written. I wrote this book, and the day that it lands, every author in the room can relate. The first time you see your book, it's just so exciting. And it just so happens that my 12, almost 13-year-old granddaughter was at my home that day. As we opened the box, she was like, "Gran, good job, congratulations. You wrote all those words? That's a really fat book." And then, as a 12-year-old can do, she said, "What's it about?" Great question, little one. So, an elevator speech to a 12-year-old. What is this book about? It's about a woman from British Columbia who spent a lot of her time in Vancouver, but all over BC and all over the world, as it turns out. She was a preacher, and lots of people thought she shouldn't be because she was a girl. My 12-year-old granddaughter, 12-year-olds have a very firm sense of justice. "That's not right," she said. "Why would they say that?" "Well, welcome to the world, little one. And as your feminism is blossoming, you too will bump your head against ceilings, I predict." But I said to her, she also did a lot of things that were a little bit outrageous, actually. "Oh, really, Gran? Like what?" "Well, like this. She went to Wreck Beach." Now, everybody from BC and beyond knows about Wreck Beach, but my 12-year-old didn't. So she's like, "What's Wreck Beach?" I said, "Oh, well, it's a beach where clothing is optional." And I opened the book, and those of you who've read it know very early in the book, this photograph appears. Again, my 12-year-old moralist said, "Gran, that's inappropriate." Bernice Gerard did this famous Wreck Beach walk in the summer of 1977. Now, before I go any further, I want to know by a show of hands, who had heard of Bernice Gerard before tonight? The 3 adjudicators and a handful of other people. Okay. If you know, you know.
I know Wreck Beach.
You know Wreck Beach. I hastened to assure my 12-year-old I left my clothes on, but I did go to Wreck Beach myself. She was quite shocked by that. I flew up to Williams Lake this afternoon on Pacific Coastal, tiny little plane, right, with just, one seat on each side of the aisle. And the man across the aisle asked me, "What brings you to Williams Lake?" I said, "Oh, I did a thing. I wrote a book, and it's receiving a prize." "Oh, congratulations." He also asked, "What's it about?" "It's a biography." I said the name, Bernice Gerard. The guy in the seat in front of me turned around and said, "No way, you wrote a book about her? Oh my gosh, she was a character." Yeah, her reputation preceded her, and her legacy follows her as well. So what is it about Bernice Gerard, then, that would cause Douglas Todd of the Vancouver Sun to say she's the most significant spiritual leader of the whole 20th century for British Columbia? Really? What did she do? A lot. She did a lot of things. And those that I encounter, and I came to Vancouver several times during the course of my research in coffee shops and various casual encounters, whenever I mentioned the name, people said, "Oh yeah, oh boy, I remember her." So people do remember her most from the 1970s, I would say. In the 1980s, Wreck Beach was one of her causes, but it wasn't the only one. She was a very vocal anti-abortionist who described herself as a feminist. Okay, that's a bit of cognitive dissonance for me. What do you mean you're a feminist in the 70s and 80s in Vancouver and you are an anti-abortionist? That does not compute. But she insisted she was a feminist, and she insisted that abortion was not okay. Her argument about that is quite complex, and I won't get into it tonight, but she always prefaced her remarks about abortion saying, if abortion had been available when my mother was birthing me, I wouldn't be here. And it's not because her mother would have chosen not to give birth, but rather her mother's circumstances. Her mother was institutionalized in Essendale, the provincial mental health facility. She said if the abortionists had had their way, it wouldn't have been a woman's right to control her own body. It would have been eugenics. And that's not okay. That's just one of the complexities of some of the arguments and positions that Bernice Gerard took, which confuse people and complicate her story. In fact, she wasn't actually opposed to Wreck Beach. You know that? She said, fine, if you want to have a clothing optional beach in Vancouver, that's fine. Stay on your own beach, though. Don't come all the way around Point Grey to all the other public beaches. And when she took this stance, she was an alderman on the City Council of Vancouver. And she was receiving letters from her constituents urging her, please say something about this. We don't mind having a nude beach, but we'd like to have beaches where that's not an option as well. So she's actually more moderate than people have perceived her to be. I think one of the reasons why her story and this book is important for BC history is because of the scope of what her life entailed. Let me tell you what I mean. And I'm going to run through the chapters really quickly. The last thing you want is a long-winded preacher at this time of night, right? I'm not a preacher, and I'll be as quick as I can. But the first section of the book deals with her early years, a typical model for a biography, right? So she was born in New Westminster in 1923. She was told that her mother died in childbirth. Turns out that wasn't true. Stay tuned a few chapters later, and it will be revealed to you as it was to her many decades later. But there she was, this newborn baby, and another woman who was at the hospital, probably for some sort of woman problem, said, there's a newborn baby without a mother. Can I have it? Yes. And so the authorities arranged for the newborn baby to go home with this other woman. In a story that's very much a reverse of everything we hear about Indigenous children and the 60s scoop and all of that, the woman who asked to take that baby home was a Stolo woman, living on the Fraser River, married to her fisherman French-Canadian husband, the Gerards. They adopted Bernice, and in another very sad twist to this plot, her adoptive mother died before Bernice reached the age of 3. So she was being raised by her adoptive father, and he was doing what people did before there was a formal adoption system or children's aid society really well formed. He was farming the kid out to family members and neighbors, and by the time she reached the end of her teen years, Bernice Gerard had lived in 17 different homes. But Mr. Gerard farmed her out as a little preschooler because what am I going to do with this little girl while I fish the Fraser? But by the time she reached school age, he wanted her back. So he went and fetched her back from her Nukamus, her Grandma Edwards, the adoptive mother's mother, and he brought her home. He abused her repeatedly for the following 6 years. And only by the time she reached the age of 12, which is this sad little face on the screen, did she garner the courage to tell the terrible secret of what her home life was actually like. And so chapter 2 is called Delivered by Strong Women. The women that Bernice Gerard disclosed that terrible secret to were preacher women. Not Pentecostals, but a pair of traveling evangelists who were coming through and holding meetings at the rural schoolhouse that Bernice walked to every day. She knew nothing of church. She had not been inside the doors of a church except once when her aunt died. And the Gerards were Catholics, and she remembers feeling really spooked by all the stuff in the Catholic Church. She remembers feeling really spooked by the funeral. And she remembers a big faux pas. She was terribly thirsty by the time they got to the church, and she drank the holy water. Oops. Her stepbrothers told her, yeah, no, you can't do that. Anyway, her first exposure to religion was very negative. But by the time she was 12 years old and these traveling evangelists came through, she was really drawn to these women. So she walked back to the schoolhouse every night to attend their meetings. And she had a very dramatic religious conversion experience at the age of 12. And she prayed, God, get me out of this situation, because it was a situation with her adoptive father. She mustered the courage and told the women the following night about what was happening. And when she arrived at school the next morning, she was greeted by her teacher, a public health officer, a social worker. They were acting on the advice of the preacher women who had said, this child needs to be removed. She was whisked into a car and off to an orphanage in Vancouver, where she stayed for a short time. That religious conversion at the age of 12 became the defining event of her entire life, her whole identity formation. And when you're 12, like Bernice was, like my granddaughter is now, you're figuring out who you are. That religious conversion became the very center of her identity. And as she was placed in other foster homes throughout her growing up years, she really fought for her faith in the sense that her caregivers were mostly middle-class, mainline Protestant homes, good Anglicans, Baptists, Christians of various stripes. But Bernice had a Pentecostal foster family, and she experienced what Pentecostals describe as the baptism of the Holy Spirit. It's kind of like you've had a religious conversion. Would you like to upsize that? Okay, it's a very intense experience with the third person of the Trinity, and Pentecostals believe that this empowers you in particular ways. And so Bernice had that experience as a very, very young teenager, and she became what her caregivers regarded as fanatical. And they decided they needed to get her out of those homes and into a more middle-class, mainstream expression of her Christianity. So chapter 3 is about that. It's called Fighting for Her Faith. She graduated from high school in Vancouver because she had been in Kamloops and the Okanagan and various foster placements. But once she got so fanatical about her religion, they removed her and brought her back to Vancouver, where they could supervise her a little more closely. She graduated high school, she went to UBC, she went to normal school, which means she was training to be a teacher. And by now, it was World War II, and there was a shortage of teachers. And so before she had completed her year of teacher training, an opening came up. Would you like to take this post? And so, yes, please. She couldn't wait to get out from under the thumb of those provincial authorities and to get out on her own and start to make a living. And so here she is pictured with the class that she taught. And her teaching career was actually very short-lived, because when she went to this new community, she met more Pentecostals. she met a pair of sisters, the McCall sisters, and they were running Pentecostal meetings out of a community hall, and she said, "Those are my people." Where she was placed was a mining community, and there was every church under the sun represented there, but she was staying at a boarding house, and she asked the woman at the boarding house, like, "So, what are the churches around here?" She said the woman started at the top of the list, apparently what she thought was probably the most respectable, Anglicans, and then down through the Methodists, the Baptists, the Presbyterians, and Bernice just kept saying, "Is that all?" "Well, there's this pair of women, and they run these meetings in the community hall." Well, a pair of women running meetings in the community hall and on the radio? She said, "They must be Pentecostal. Those are my women." And the boarding house lady said, "You know what? Pentecostals also believe in this thing called tithing. And it means that you give 1/10 of your income to the church." Can you imagine those miners paid by Cominco are really earning pretty decent wages? All those girls have to do is get 10 families, and they're earning as much as a mining family is earning. Bernice found her people when she found the McCall sisters. Not only did she minister with them in that mining town, but after the war ended, they took that show on the road, and they traveled internationally. This picture in the bottom corner of the slide is a Pentecostal tent meeting. Hundreds of people would come, and they traveled all across North America doing these meetings and filling the collection plates every night. And that is how the McCall-Gerard trio made their living in the business of evangelism. She traveled for almost 15 years with the McCall sisters, and they visited, like I said, everywhere that you can imagine across North America. They actually got hired by a denomination in the States called the Assemblies of God, which is a big brand of Pentecostalism. And they hired the girls, the trio, to travel beyond North America into Latin America, into South America, to Europe, to observe where Pentecostal missionaries were, to go and minister to those missionaries, but take lots of pictures, make movies, come back, and we'll hire you to go on a tour throughout the US raising funds for missions. So they did that for a very long time, until 1958. In 1958, both of the McCall sisters accepted marriage proposals. And Bernice was on her own. What's she going to do now? Well, she decided she'll go back to school. She'll go back and finish that degree at UBC that she never finished before. And so she did. She went and finished a BA, and then she wrote an MA thesis on Paradise Lost, in which she defended Milton's orthodoxy, saying everybody thinks he's not orthodox. Well, I say he is. I don't like what he says about women, but other than that, mostly, I really agree with his creative presentation of the gospel message. In fact, she regarded Milton as a bit of a role model because she wanted creative ways to present the gospel on the campuses of UBC and Simon Fraser. When I found out that Simon Fraser University had a Pentecostal chaplain, I was shocked. That university has a reputation for being the most political hot spot for the student movement in the late 60s and early 70s, and there was Bernice Gerard acting as a university chaplain. While she was a university chaplain, and you can see in that picture on the left that she was the only female chaplain, all the other chaplains were men, and they represented the mainline Christian denominations. At the same time, she leveraged the experience she had had in Rossland, BC, when she was working with the McCall sisters on the radio, and she opened an open line radio show. Douglas Todd thinks that maybe that's why she was so well known throughout the Pacific Northwest, not just in Vancouver, but down into the States and up the coast and way beyond, because she had a way of being on air that was really, really engaging. Okay, I want you to remember that it's the 60s and the 70s. When I was teaching social history classes, I would ask my class, so if I say 60s and 70s, let's play word association. What do you say? Sex and drugs and rock and roll, right? Right. And Bernice Gerard went on air, late night phone-in shows, and she said, call me, ask me anything. Listeners thought, okay, game on. Because she seemed like such an old prude, right? In the papers, she was being satirized as this person born in the wrong century. When she walked Wreck Beach, they said, hey, Miss Gerard, there's a hole in the knee of your bathing suit. You know, get over it. You're in the wrong century and the wrong town. This is Vancouver. People called her and they spilled the tea, as my kids would say. They really engaged with her and they told her deeply personal, intimate stories in a very pastoral or sort of maybe better counselor to client way. She heard people's deepest, darkest secrets. Secrets about extramarital and premarital affairs, secrets about abortions that were botched, secrets about the experimentation that people were making with drugs. Don't tell my parents. People called her and said, I've never told this to anyone before. In fact, they didn't tell those stories on air. They wrote letters to her. So those letters, a collection of them, are in her archive. And some of those stories are absolutely heart-wrenching, as you will see if you read the book in chapter 7. So why was she so effective on the radio? Some people think it was because she was a woman. There were lots of radio preachers out there, but most of them were men, except the famous one, Amy Semple McPherson, maybe. But most of them were men, and most of them were fire and brimstone, yelling at you and telling you your soul was condemned. Bernice didn't do that. She listened, she asked questions, and then, like a very sympathetic old auntie, she would say, you know what? I think I know what it is you're seeking. You're not really seeking, a more enhanced sexual experience. You're not really finding what you wish you would with taking drugs. You are trying to fill an existential void in your soul. And very sympathetically and very consistently, she would say, you know what you're really looking for? Jesus. You're really looking for Jesus. And if you really want to make that stick, you're looking for the Holy Spirit. And then she went into her Pentecostal message. But the kind of relationships that she established and maintained with those radio audiences is astonishing. The depth of the secrets that were told to her. So the last part of the book, I stop following the chronology and I go off onto thematic sort of tangents. In chapter 8, it's called Challenging Patriarchal Authorities. She got herself in a lot of hot water with the boys back at denominational headquarters in Toronto. She got in hot water because Pentecostals did not ordain women, not until the late 1980s. But she'd been on the road preaching and ordained since the 1940s. So she had no patience for these pedantic debates about whether or not women could actually be preachers. She's like, I just am one. Whether you like it or not, it was God's idea, not mine. That's the higher authority than you. I'm over it. I don't want to argue with you. The other thing she got into hot water about was working with Catholics. Now, to a 21st century ear, that sounds silly. Isn't that just another flavor of Christianity? What's the big deal? But some of you will know that go back a few decades to mid-20th century and after, no. Cross-denominational cooperation was not on. It was extremely rare to find cooperation even among Protestant denominations. But to cross that line and cooperate with Catholics was like out of bounds. But Bernice Gerard did that because the charismatic movement was beginning. And this was a social, cultural phenomenon where not just Pentecostals, but Christian churches of all stripes started to have an experience of what they said was the presence of the Holy Spirit in what many of us would regard as kind of paranormal ways. People speaking in tongues, people being supernaturally healed, people having very emotive and embodied expressions of their religion. And that's not typical for Anglicans and United Church folks, but that was happening across North America and around the world, the charismatic movement. And Bernice Gerard said, well, if the Spirit is moving, I'm there. I'm going to go follow where the Spirit's moving. And so she started attending house church and prayer meetings with Catholics in Vancouver. Now, I know a lot about this because she reflected a lot about it and said, oh my goodness, if I get caught, I'm in big trouble. If they knew that I spent my weeknight evenings in these smoke-filled homes, because Pentecostals don't smoke, they don't dance, they don't drink, they don't chew, and they don't go out with girls that do. They were very sort of Methodist in their holiness codes. She said, if they could see me in these smoke-filled rooms with Catholics praying, seeking the Holy Spirit, I'd be in really hot water. In fact, one day, she had invited a campus guest to come and speak to the students she was talking to on her campus ministry. And when she went to the Vancouver airport to pick him up, he was accompanied by a Catholic priest, and she was like, no, if I get caught with a Catholic in my car, I'm in trouble. And she was in trouble. Somebody saw her. And then one of the students that attended the meetings was like a mole. And they went back and said, hey, you know what she's doing? She's bringing Catholics. And she brought them and said we should accept them and we should pray with them. And so she was disciplined by her own denomination. She was called up before the authorities. What are you doing? She said, I didn't know you. I didn't invite him. He just came. It was a package deal. I invited that guy, but he brought a priest. It's not my fault. But more than that, she was very open to what was happening in the Catholic renewal through the charismatic movement. And word got back to the headquarters in Toronto. And again, she was disciplined. We don't talk to Catholics. We don't work with Catholics. She's like kind of her own thing, but that is not our official position. She also got into trouble with the boys over the ordination question as well. So there's her ordination certificate. And she'd been ordained, as I said, since the 40s with the Assemblies of God, and then double ordained later in the 1980s with the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada. She wrote her own biography, her autobiography, twice. She wrote it when she was 30-something to describe her own conversion experience and how she came to accept that Pentecostalism was not unorthodox. And she wrote it again when she was 65 to reflect back on all the experiences she had had. In that second biography, she tackled the question of women and feminism. And she said, if you'd like to know about my feminism, just read my footnotes. I was like, okay, game on. Like, I'm that academic. I read the footnotes and the bibliography first, and then I read the book. So I was like, game on, Bernice. And I did read her footnotes. But I was also reading the sermon notes, that what she was preaching and how that evolved over the years. And I knew she wasn't telling it all in the autobiography. She was influenced by secular feminism in ways that shocked me. Like, she was reading Germaine Greer, okay? And if you don't know, let me tell you, that's way out there in terms of the sort of sexual suggestions that Germaine Greer was making. In chapter 9, I also go where most historians would fear to tread, and that is to try to ask some very difficult questions about the relationship that Bernice Gerard had with Velma McCall. The threesome that you see on your screen is, in the middle is Velma McCall, and the man is her husband, the one she married in 1958, and Bernice Gerard. They were a household of 3. Yeah. The night that he proposed to Velma, he apologized to Bernice and said, I know how much you two love each other and how close you are. Why don't you come and live with us? Okay. So she did. And for 20 years during Velma and Dick's marriage, Bernice lived there, and when he died, Velma and Bernice carried on. So I'll just leave it there. It's quite titillating. What was the nature of that relationship? Chapter 10 focuses on her public engagement, the years when she was a city councillor, the absolute hoot that the media, especially the Georgia Straight, had with her and making fun of her. So political cartoonists had a very good time. If you'd like to hear Bernice Gerard yourself, and if you don't already have a vocal soundtrack of her, think of the movie Mrs. Doubtfire. She looked like that, very mannish. She sounded like that. Her voice was baritone, and she sang. But if you Google her, not right now, but when I'm done talking, you will find this YouTube video of her explaining the public engagement and the protests that she was making, not just Wreck Beach, but protesting on screen and stage things like Caligula, which she described as hardcore pornography. That's what she's saying in that frame right there, hardcore pornography. I make the argument that that face right there is the same face you saw when she was 12. And I think the anger for her engagement publicly, protesting about women and abuse of women, is tied to her own status as a sexual abuse survivor. I don't think anybody ever said that about her before, so that's original. This is a biography. When I was finished writing it, almost, I was working on the conclusion. I was reading lots of theory of biography and feminist theory of biography, and I came across an article that said, in every biography, there's an awful lot of autobiography on the part of the historian. And I was like, no, there's not. And then I was like, is there? Really? I don't know. My conclusion reflects on that. What does Bernice Gerard have to do with me? This picture, when I showed it to my 12-year-old granddaughter, she's like, what is that? I said, it's a selfie. It's from 1951, but it's a selfie. It's Bernice Gerard looking into a mirror, taking a picture of herself. And I really feel like in her autobiographies, in her archival record, and in this book, I hope, I give you a glimpse into, because I think I really got inside her head. I really think I did. So she looked in the mirror, and I'm looking at her looking in the mirror in this book. What does she have to do with me or with us or with BC history for that matter? A lot. This book goes through a lot of themes that touch on aspects of BC history. The history of childhood, the history of adoption and child welfare in this province, faith and feminism. That debate's not over, folks. Women in ministry, same-sex relationships. That's chapter 9, the second part, if you just want to skip ahead, about what I think I saw. Secularization and irreligion. Your province is the one in the Canadian census that reports the most people when you ask them what's their religion. None. Not N-U-N, but N-O-N-E. None. I don't have a religion. The religious right and public engagement. And if you think we don't have a religious right in Canada, you're not paying attention. We do, and it's got deep roots, and she was part of it. And then biography, memoir, autobiography. All of these things are themes that the book touches on. So I want to thank you for your generous review of it in your remarks tonight, and I hope that as the rest of you pick it up and read it, you will find that this is true. There's a lot of BC in BG, Bernice Gerard. Thank you very much.